I'm the original one.
Who's going to talk today on his colleague, Mr. Greaves' duplication theory. So, welcome, Stephen.
Good afternoon. Nicholas Greaves is the Dr. Johnson, I'm his Boswell. I'm the guy who is always trying to get him better expressed publicly. So that's what I'm doing here. I timed this morning, comes up about 45 minutes. That's pretty heavy. So I'm going to try to go really fast. So if you think I'm going too fast, just slow me down. If you think I'm going too slow, please give me reactions, because I've never actually presented, had practice with, T and DT, and how many words you get in so much time. So, the Daily Mail headline is that this theory explains three unbelievably important phenomena, which we measure, we use them, but we have not explained them. They're all instances of Greaves' duplication theory.
Who's?
Nicholas Greaves, my man I'm telling you about.
Right.
The guy I'm Dr. Boswell to. Right?
Right.
He's Dr. Johnson as well. We've described them, we've catalogued them, we've quantified them, we've written Maxwell equations, seeing what they do, but we've not found exactly how or why they happen. The first one is memory, human memory. We don't know how we hold a memory in our brains. The second one is the fact that my nose is the same shape as my father's. Nobody's got a real explanation for that. They just say, I see that gene, I see that nose. That's all. They don't say how. And the other is electromagnetic induction. They say, oh, we can see this, we can measure it, we can use it. But nobody says exactly why it happens. So, as you can see, the first one, they're all basic. The first one's basic to our perception. The second one's basic to our life, and the third is basic to our current technology. The first one operates across time, the second operates across time and space, and the third operates across space. They're all phenomena of transmission of form without reproduction. Sorry?
Well, wouldn't you say that the number 3 also involves time, and then you have a varying field, and you induce a varying current?
Hold on. Yeah, and you're on item 3, right? I've now lost the page. Yes, of course. I have to do this whole thing almost in cartoon form. It's the only way to get it across, to write it in headlines. Partly because I'm not good enough or familiar enough with it. So I think you're saying electromagnetic induction involves time. Yes, of course. But it seems to me to transmit broadly across space. I've got a wire here and somebody reading it over there. Sort of. Right? There's an awful lot of need to put this in cartoon form to be able to get it across at all. A little bit of spiel here. Reproduction of shape in life forms. Without it, evolution would not exist. It's the very basis of Darwin. We wouldn't be here. Without memory, we might still be insects. We've got these things called brains that are stuck onto us. And without, well, electromagnetic induction is a sort of extra on the cake that we've made into a mainstay of our lives. Anyway, these are not obscure subjects. They're not out-of-the-way things. They're looking us in the face every day. They stare us in the face, yet science has never really resolved them. Has hardly looked at them, looked at memory, looked at why that leaf is the same as the one of the previous generation. They merit some pretty radical attention. We haven't given it. It's rather like this poet from the 16th, 17th century said, the world is a mirror of infinite beauty, yet no man sees it. Doesn't see the mirror nor the infinite beauty. And so I compare this phrase romantically to the moment before a discovery. The world is a mirror of infinite beauty, yet no man sees it. Now, I take this romantic tone just to inspire, because I think that's probably what this gathering is rather about. To inspire by taking a different view and to encourage excitement. Going to some history, Greaves wrote this all in a spate in around 78 to 79, 80. And he sent it off to a number of distinguished people. One of them was Arthur Koestler, who wrote back. This is his letter. Arthur Koestler said, I found it immensely stimulating and liked your resonance hypothesis, but send it to David Bohm because he understands about physics. You'll see on the bottom of the letter, Greaves wrote no response from Bohm, but we have other news. Why was I excited when Greaves, my friend, showed me this letter in 1979? He was a 30-year-old non-scientist who's married to a friend of mine with a law degree who'd taken 2 years off to read science in the British Museum reading room and come up with something that excited Arthur Koestler. I thought that was completely amazing. Am I wrong? I'm looking around to see. It seems to me that was amazing on its own. So how could that be? And there I was sitting in front of him in his living room. I was only on a visit. I'd just gone abroad and I stayed abroad for 30 years. But I came back for a visit in 1979 and he told me about it. So I've just sort of come back establishing myself And I told this to Nick, and she said, you've got to tell it to us. I spent years and years trying to draft this so that I can tell it to people. This is the first time I've actually got it into a shape where it's actually spoken to anybody. You can also see it on Greaves' website, which is called mindandmemory.net, that comes later on, which talks about his conclusions. But it's not exactly a didactic enterprise. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to give you an a projection of it rather quickly. So this is the first time I'm sending it to scientists, showing it to scientists. I became a translator and then became good enough to write a book-length writing. So I never found the angle through which to present it, nor the people to present it to. They are you today. You are the people who are going to tell me whether it's any good. You're 17 times more contact, if there are 17 of you, than this thing has had per year with scientists over the last 30 years. So I'm asking for your help. Greaves has actually gone away. He said, I'm not going to break my annual holiday where I go to my place in France for this, but Stephen can do it. Okay, Stephen's doing it. He's rather skeptical of presenting any much more to anyone, but I've got this privilege, so I'm doing it. Second person he got a letter from was Carl Prybram, who said, and I'm only just quoting 4 phrases, I think what you're saying is so. It's most interesting piece. Your writing style is superb. It's an excellent piece of scholarship with some revision and bringing up to date. It might be worth publishing. He wrote at the bottom of his handwriting, this bloke is possibly the world's most eminent authority on the operation of the brain. He certainly is, in my opinion, as well as being very considerate and kind to aspiring unknowns. So he then got one from, these are the people he sent it to. Henry Marginau of Yale, I don't know if I remember that, who said, a lot of rude things at the bottom, but at the top, your manuscript's fascinating and enormous in scope. The range it covers recommended to be presented to public view. He sent it to Josephson, the one who got the Nobel Prize, who also pointed out exactly what's wrong with his initial presentation. It's all there. Those of you who've got it on paper can see. And I can give it to you on paper or send it by PDF. We have it on the website. But don't let me discourage you completely, as intuition itself can be very powerful. And it's quite possible that there are important things to be found out in the area into which you're looking. Rupert Sheldrake.
Both Josephson and Sheldrake were one-time members of ANPA.
One time?
Yeah.
Right.
Josephson was the guy that pointed out to me in 2004 that ANPA was taking place in Cambridge.
Oh, right. Oh. Good. Well, that's what Josephson said. He said, you're really just describing rather than producing a theory, but the fact that he's describing, looking at 3 things and saying they're the same thing is pretty fascinating. Anyway, he said it should be looked at. I went back one. Rupert wrote this long letter here, Rupert Sheldrake, and they're now old friends. And you'll see Rupert's reference to the Akashic Records, which I put in a ring, which is one of the things I'm going to, this concept predicts, as it were. Right? That's what Rupert Sheldrake replied. Lovely. Analyzing, you know. We're all in the same boat, me, you, and who's the other one? Anyway, it comes later. Okay, he started off. It was initially for him, it was a perception of memory as a repetition of pattern. His obsession was with pattern. Secondly, it was a perception that the process that he imagined for memory can attractively be proposed also to describe 2 other completely unexplained phenomena. Electromagnetic, what? Memory and what? What's going on? And reproduction of form in living beings. He's going across time, he's going across space. He's mixing 3 things together. His final conclusions, his axiom, conclusion and not axioms, conclusion. Equal intervals in time and similar actions tend to duplicate themselves through all space. Equal intervals in space, similar structures tend to duplicate themselves all through all time. Well, the words space and time are actually interchangeable. Well, that sounds like what Oprah Winfrey would call woo-woo, doesn't it? Now, have a look at where he got it and what he's going with it. He looks at what is the same place. He starts off with Heisenberg. He says, at a subatomic scale, knowing, I'm not going to get this absolutely right physically, but he says, knowing both direction and the velocity of a perceivable piece of matter, a thing, a piece of matter, is, quotes, not possible, not practicable, not highly probable. And then, since we can't tell where it is, if we could tell where it was, that itself would be a singularity, because we can't tell where it is. Now, Defining singularity as a region or situation to describe which we might likely have to look beyond the limits of our physics, outside our classical world. That's a singularity. It's the end of our physics. It's where the window is. You have to jump out. That's interesting. It's a chair that's falling over, I imagine. I thought they might, but I put my coat on. So, if two particles were or are in exactly the same position, that's actually impossible because we can't tell where they are. This is a very specious argument. Look at my bracket. Also, we cannot allege that they are in the same position because we can't tell the position of either because, according to Heisenberg and company, we can't know it. But if two particles were in exactly the same position, that would be a singularity. If the situations of the constituent particles of the particle were in exactly the same relation to each other, if they were in the same arrangement, that would be a singularity. If that one's exactly equal to that one at any time. And therefore, if two structures are exactly equal to one another, exactly equal to subatomic scale, that would be a singularity. So he invents a new singularity, two things being exactly the same. There he has it. If two structures were exactly equal, that would be a singularity, which of course refers to the post-asymptotic limit where absolute similarity has been achieved. I now make a joke, which I did a couple of days ago. For shorthand, let's call this a similarity that goes beyond Heisenberg, a Counter-Heisenberg Singularity. I'm just trying to get this into the mind of whoever's listening to it. It might be erudite or normal. It's a special type of singularity. It's that one that goes beyond the Heisenberg limit of our being able to know things. So, Counter-Heisenberg Singularity is any edge of our physics where things become just very, very, very similar. So what happens as we approach that singularity? Suggestions welcome. For the speed of light, we know we have expansion of mass, the distortion of shape. Things get smaller, bigger, heavier. For absolute zero temperature, we've got some strange macro effects, but they're almost predictable mechanically. We have two lines meet at infinity from Euclid, but that's just conceptualizing, a lot of ancient Greeks having a good time. Black holes, well, there must be a lot of things we know about black holes, but as far as the layman looks at the only thing we know about black holes is we can't see to give you an answer, which is actually not much of a postulate, but what happens close to singularities. So, what happens close to this singularity of absolute, absolute identity of the shape, particle, arrangement of two things? He says, consider two systems, each one consists of a set of particles. Imagine a movement of their constituent parts of the second one, if you like, to be nearly similar to the first one. What happens as they approach? Will they shy away from it because it's impossible? Will he has energy be released as one of his ideas, because he got it into his head that you put two atoms of hydrogen together to make an atom of helium, and you're putting two things in the same place, they're operating into each other's areas, orbits, you're putting two things in the same place, energy is released because you can see what's wrong with that, but there's also something rather attractive about it as an idea. He says, possibly energy will be released when we reach that singularity. Perhaps the world explodes, perhaps something explodes. Will there be some kind of force field formed, as actually seems to happen with electromagnetism, eh? Well, so what will happen? So he postulates. It's impossible for that situation to actually become that singularity. So on close approach, a situation is generated that expresses or relieves that impossibility. Now here's what I'm going to ask you to invent what he tried to invent. This is just a little, what they call disclaimer at the beginning. He says on his website, first, that the creation of form and order out of chaos is no more than the repetition of similar intervals in space. The fact that that is so is pretty much self-evident, but why seems to be little considered, and that's what his theory is looking at. Any hypothesis on such an ambitious scale has to be based on conjectures, which are necessarily subjective. In other words, the first time anybody's ever looking at it, you start with a conjecture. My prime interest is to provide an explanation for the mechanism of memory, since if I could achieve that, then a lot of other things fall into place. I'm also aware that although major advances have been made in understanding the rules of nature by the physicists, the cleverest people in the world, yet nobody has yet managed to put up an explanation of the operation of memory in any convincing form, detail. And this is, I think, me saying, the cases in observed nature from which he forms his putative conjecture are so varied, and the mechanisms that will be involved so various that there's a temptation to reject them as not arising from anything in particular, as not arising from any one single observed phenomenon, like, wouldn't it be nice if it was black body radiation? Single phenomenon, single observation, great principle. But, read on. I say to you, just in case, because I didn't know anything about you, in case you're a bunch of skeptics, which I gather you're quite the opposite, I put in my own little disclaimer shot here across the bars. Though he starts with, and is clearly most excited by memory, the temptations to see the effects, the same principle at work in two completely different forms of nature, reproduction of form in living organisms and electromagnetic induction. I think that's too attractive a temptation for any self-respecting scientist to shy away from and say it's nonsense. He's got to say, my God, these things look similar. That's really interesting. I should have a look at that. I say that's so enticing that I invite you to join in positively, this is you, individuals, and not reject these ideas as not immediately proven, not mathematically demonstrated, like some of the people who wrote them, but help, please, to work on a mechanical, maybe physical, maybe quantum explanation of what he proposes, which comes in later pages. And perhaps more importantly, I think this is really quite important, create a mathematics which will enable us to look at the varying degrees of similarity involved in various situations. So that's highly similar, we may expect an effect. That's less similar, we don't expect an effect. That would enable some predictions to be made from whatever theory emerges. And it says, okay, here's what he says. The bases for his mechanics of memory, his axioms are: a thought is the perceived result of a structure in the brain. You may not believe that's, you may believe that's not so, but that's his axiom premise. A thought is a perceived result of a structure, a movement of something in the brain. The brain is an interconnected system of always firing synapses. He says later on, they're always firing even when you're asleep, because living systems have to keep going. Thinking and perception are the employment of order and pattern in the positioning of structured events among this mass of always firing synapses. I'm putting in one page in 10 seconds stuff that it took me years of listening to and to actually manage to absorb.
Right,
Trying. Well,
I'm glad you did.
yeah. Doing well. I like being interrupted because it means I think I can get some feedback. I will remember today.
The stuff you're saying is very good.
Oh, good. I will remember today a thought I had yesterday. If I experience the same structure in the brain as happened yesterday, right about this time, I met a girl at a wedding in a green hat, and it came into my mind that the image would be girl, wedding, green hat. So I remember the picture. You can say girl, you can say wedding, you can say green, you can say hat, and I get, wow, yeah, I got that memory back. Get a corner of the memory, and it restructures the whole thing. How does that happen? What's my next line here? Memory is therefore the transmission of structure across time, which is extremely exciting for us who've been stuck in 3 dimensions for a long time and never taken time seriously except our last 100 years. A part of the brain that is in the trance or alpha state, which I think you can see what I mean by that, is in a random state, where he axiomizes it, with no order in the firing of its synapses. The way he says that transmission from one brain to another, mine today to mine tomorrow, or in extreme cases ESP, mine to his, in the same time frame, not the main thing here, is that both are in both are in a random state. So this is something that can be transmitted from a random cloud of particles to another random cloud of particles, and I've got an experiment which almost indicates that has happened, which I'll tell you because I've forgotten to write it down here. I said that so you can remind me of it. Part of this is apparently there's Ilya Prigogine, who I can't pronounce, has said that perfect randomness would be a state of order. You will know whether that's the case. But anyway, that's part of his spiel. You can't have perfect randomness, it's dangerous for his theory. You've got to have, like I always, when everybody else was interested in failure, in success, I had to think about failure. I was going to be a failure, but if you're actually trying to be a failure and you succeeded, that's no good. So there's the same thing. Perfect randomness would be a state of order, that's what he said. You probably know what eidetic memory is, when a savant goes up to London Eye, somebody on television recently, and looks around, comes down and draws the whole scene, 360 degrees. These savants, or people can remember a whole symphony, well, that's quite common, conductors do that, or say a scene in perfect photographic detail. These are often people, the rest of whose brains has not been culturally disciplined, tramlined, told what to do. So they've got space there to remain random. And it's the random that does the perfect memorizing. And we just put a tiny bit into random to remember a few things. And of course, in accordance with Greaves' principle, one of the ways by which we remember is by repeating something. We put it in this repeated times, and that's what makes it transmit to future universe called tomorrow. Okay, well, he observes this. He sees something happening when a pattern in yesterday's brain is simply repeated today, and he looks like Mr. Ockham said, for the simplest explanation. The structure is transmitted. It's the simplest explanation. He intuits that's what. I think we should call that a resonance effect, by which, developing from what he says, the potential to copy a form, rather like an electric field. I do something electric here, out here something has the potential to happen. I call that a field. Now, if I call that, I'm electric, talking electrics, that's okay. But if I'm Sheldrake, calling that a morphic field, that's a mortal sin. Oh yeah, oh okay. So, he says the potential to copy a form is projected across time and results in memory. And then later he looks and sees the same thing going on with pattern being transmitted across space in electromagnetic induction. The correspondence is staggeringly similar. You know, I mean, you can go to details and say we've got Maxwell's equations and dipole, it's space and time together and so on. But this is the detail of what happens with it. But the correspondence is amazing, completely amazing. And then he says, well, that oak leaf is the same as several generations ago. That too is completely amazing. But all that information is written on some triple helix, double helix thing, double back on itself, written on it. Really? Written on it? Okay. So the following pages, what I've done is I've got the stuff out of the file and I looked at what it was that he sent to those people all that time ago and how he expressed it. And I'm about to show you the way he tried to figure what's actually going on in this resonance between a set of particles in a structure today in a random environment and another random environment in the future, picking up that structure and duplicating. He's looking for a way to explain it. Now, while he's looking and I'm reading it to you, I want you to be looking, please, and come with your rather better explanations. The following pages are how he explored it from memory all that time ago. I've been asking many times. I've come back and visited even in those 30 years. I've come back and sat down and said, we need step 4. We really haven't got it, have we? Now, I actually never got around to reading it again because the first time I read it, I didn't think it was very convincing. It's on the next pages. And I said this text, so I thought the thing is to show you what he wrote. I added an element at the end in which I take it out of particles and put it into waves, which has a magical effect, which I did yesterday or this morning or something. My request to you today is, request number 1, there's such a strong looking case that this remarkable natural effect, memory, takes place by a mechanism this sort or one akin to it. You are scientists, please work on the mechanism. Help us better theorize this structure of how this happens. Please work on this idea to see if the intuited idea can be given a solid underpinning. Then, request number 2. For the theory of the mechanism, I think we're going to need to quantify degrees of similarity so we can get some control over predicting what happens in what circumstances. So I think this is going to require a mathematics of similarity. So I'm requesting you to conceive a mathematics of similarity and work on it. Okay, he says that memory is pattern located in past time, repeated in present time, he says. I'm still not into what he actually wrote. A pattern that has occurred, usually repeatedly, you repeated in the past when you learned the national anthem, within a random arrangement of particles, in this case an animal brain that's in relaxed, neutral, random trance state, i.e. a brain that's temporarily relieved of any literalistic, frontal cortex, Cartesian structures, a random cloud of moving electrical connections with no structure in it. Any pattern that has occurred in one of those will be repeated in any other such brain that is very similarly random, into which a part of that pattern is introduced. That's his first theory. That's to say that when you introduce a part of that source pattern, the whole of the rest of the source pattern is repeated within that random structure. The source image will be reproduced as a copy of the original. I now reproduce his conjecture, his first conjecture, which he put down in 1979. Fascinating, but it seems to me a different expression of the same thing might be helpful, and maybe brilliant in itself. You guys can tell me, so your opinions please. Okay, what happens as one situation comes close to being the same as another? He proposes, I just take a line from his other stuff, it's impossible for that situation to become that singularity, so on close approach, a situation is generated that expresses or relieves that impossibility. This is from the summary that was sent to all those people that time ago. I took this in optical character recognition from his TypeScript yesterday and corrected the mistake. I don't know whether you can read this. I'd like to read it absurdly quickly. He says, in writing his text, reading his text, a vital point common to all singularity states is that although they are unobtainable, when closer approaches are made to them, the rules of nature as they're familiar to us begin to change radically. The exotic effects, superconductivity, superfluidity, are manifested when temperatures come to close to absolute zero. As small elementary particles are accelerated close to the velocity of light, their mass or energy starts to increase asymptotically. Their time scale slows down, their dimensions shrink. It would therefore seem reasonable to anticipate that when near perfect structure duplication is achieved at, say, the molecular scale or below, then curious effects might start to show up. Further, since it's already been shown that perfect structure duplication is singular, for the same reason as he says matter impenetrability is singular, which he relates to Heisenberg, then it might not be unreasonable to assume that similar effects, weird effects, might be observed when we get close to singularity state. Well, whether or not such an assumption seems reasonable to the reader, I made it to extrapolate the consequences on the macro scale to see if I could identify any such anticipated results with familiar observed phenomena. He then goes on about hydrogen atoms. He said, we are all too familiar with what happens when separate nuclei of hydrogen atoms are compressed together. They fuse to form a nucleus of a new element accompanied by vast quantities of liberation of energy. I assume that in the limiting case, if one structure at a later time did perfectly duplicate an earlier structure, then that later structure should convert entirely to a very violent flash of radiation energy. But I couldn't think of anything where that actually happened, so I went back to a close approach scenario where perhaps a small amount of energy might be released, perhaps by the conversion of only a few molecules in the later structure. There's 3 pages of this. However, and now he put in a couple of paragraphs in memory. He said, I have no case in the present example of eidetic memory to show that there was any conversion of mass to energy, except that there would need to be a driving force to position the later thought structure into the duplicate shape. This was a problem until I read some early books by Mach. From the turn of the century, I was prompted to reconsider one of the fundamental principles of physics, the minimum energy principle. This states, very simply, that all systems tend to their most stable state. So he looks at a way in which he can explain his duplication from the minimum energy principle, which I was never perfectly instinctively convinced by in my quote gut. But I'm putting it down so you can look at it and see if you can improve it. This states very simply that all systems tend to their most stable state, the one containing the least energy. This being so, a second similar structure to a first in time, given absolute freedom of movement, ought to tend, he says, to move, to duplicate more precisely the earlier structure, because by doing so it would be increasing its potential to convert the rest mass of its constituent particles to radiation energy. In other words, in an energy sink map, he says that it will tend to go upwards towards the explosive point, which is actually higher energy, because it will be closer to being able to get rid of it all. That doesn't seem to me to make sense in the normal minimum energy principle thing, but it might inspire you guys to have a similar idea. Or different, hopefully. If the duplication was singularly perfect, the most stable state of complete conversion of mass to energy would be achieved, which of course never happens. One reason that happens is that on the micro level of the atoms and molecules, the earlier structure, which we're trying to imitate here and today, and we're looking at yesterday's, is always in motion. It's in Brownian motion, and it's in motion anyway. Therefore, as the second structure moves to duplicate it, it's already moved on to being a slightly different structure. That's quite important. So he's saying that the copying in today's structure of the previous one is a sort of running after the previous, so it never becomes an actual singularity. Why it should move up toward that high energy point instead of downwards, I don't know yet. If the motion of the elementary particles of the first structure could be frozen, then perhaps instances of perfect structure duplication leading to atomic energy release might be observed, but of course such motion only ceases at absolute zero, and then he puts in a little joke. That's another singularity state. A good thing too is perhaps it throws a little more insight on why all matter must remain in motion. Or a separate thing. I reason that the freedom of motion of the second, later structure would have to be very well lubricated indeed and not disturbed in any way by external forces. The more I thought about this, with respect to perfect recall, the people have perfect memory, perfect photographic recall, the more some of the facts seem to dovetail together. Eidetic memory seems to appear naturally most often in children before adolescence, when their minds have not yet been too cluttered with too many inculcated behavior patterns and beliefs. Most subjects under hypnotic trance appear to be capable of regression to relive in perfect detail episodes of their early life. This appears to be the same phenomenon as photographic memory, but a little more comprehensive. Since under trance, the subject's mind can be instructed to exclude all external stimuli, which exactly provides the random environment that's required in the mind for the memory. His last page. Oh, I've gone back. Hold on. Last page. It's known that nerve cells in the brain never stop firing. Obviously, all the functions of the body have to be continued and regulated for the body to remain alive. But if under trance, instructions to exclude all the external stimuli and to relax the mind completely, to think of nothing, which is almost impossible to do when you're conscious, then it is reasonable to consider those brain cells that contain conscious thought are firing randomly. If somehow into this random system of electrochemical currents is imposed a single thought structure that closely duplicates an earlier observation of the external world, then there will be an increasing potential, however small, for a later thought structure to convert an infinitesimal fraction of its rest mass to energy. I found this specious, and I still do, but he's looking for a mechanism. Indeed, such a potential might manifest itself strong enough to be just sufficient to overwhelm the small energy level of the brain that must persist for the random firing of the brain cells. I'm not sure I got that right. If this occurred, then the second thought structure will move to duplicate the earlier thought more closely. For this to occur, there has to be complete exclusion of all external forces, perturbation, but this is assumed possible in special circumstances of a trance state, or when you go into a, I think I'll just relax my mind and try to remember state. Now, if this is going over the obvious again, if the first image in time moves on to change its structure, as it inevitably will have done, then the later structure will move to duplicate that change in order to keep the system's energy level to a minimum. It seems to me like it's a maximum, but there we go. It will use the energy inherent in the randomly firing system to provide the force to drive this change. And if the trance state is continued so that no signals from the external world are let in to disturb the copycat motion of the later thought structure, then a continuous process of replication will take place. There's a great deal of assumption in all this, but it can certainly be argued that such a process would be consistent with what is observed to happen in a subject under regression in hypnotic trance. And there's no doubt experimentally that people do go into hypnotic trances and remember a lot of stuff, and that some people can record 360 degrees from the top of the tower and draw it later. It does happen. So he's got this strong vision of how the process works, but it's not definitive. I think it sounds close to a brilliant new idea, but the correct version may be different. The important thing is to be invoking these ideas and ask you to assess it, if necessary, improve or substitute it as a means of upholding the concept that a resonance of this type across both time and space may be possible. I've done a bit of bullshit here. I was actually training my own mind to see what I was doing. I call it a summing up. It's not really. I'm just going over it again. He intuits there is a resonance. He imagines a means by which it may occur. System A at time t exists at time t and has likely been reinforced by repetition anyway. System B, when it started, comes close to being exactly similar to the initial form of AT. If it did become the same, there would be a weird event. The minimum energy principle exists. By some means, this principle ensures that system AT, instead of allowing system B to become 100% equal to it, which might mean a nuclear explosion as a result of singularity, it transmits the form and the information into system B while it's in motion, but with a tiny time difference. It's imitating what my thing yesterday was, small t later. Slightly after the existence of big A, small t at any time, so that as Greaves understands the minimum energy principle, the potential to move closer to singularity, which would be a nuclear explosion, as it were, is averted by the time difference. So I just write myself a formula which is obvious. So I say, if this communication sounds unlikely in a mechanical Newtonian billiard ball world, as it does, it takes on some likelihood, or even a possible uncanny plausibility, if we consider that subatomic reality works not in objects, but waves of probability, sort of shorthand for this probability frequency of FTPs, PDFs, PowerPoints. Okay, another same mechanism expressing the waves, complete amateur, trying to put a waveform shape over his apparently slightly gobbledygook playing with the minimum energy principle. That's very similar to what happens in tunneling when part of the location probability of an electron is already across the gap to the other conductor on the other side. Perhaps the probability waves, PDFs, whatever they are, of what may happen, begin to cover similar areas, and their probability distribution, shall we say, begin to overlap, communicate with each other, exchange influence, and either in space, across a gap in space, or across a gap in time. Could that probability of effect be passed on through that means, passed on from one probability distribution to another, of event A to that of event B, or part thereof? Could it be that the exchange of content of probability patterns can happen when you are close to this singularity? Now, I think that's a really interesting idea. But you guys are serious physicists, you can tell me whether it is or isn't. I feel this has possibilities, not a bad postulate, a beginning of one for the resonance mechanism. And the correspondence in which these three things are seen to be instances of the same effect and coming from the same logic is so shocking, so satisfying, so exciting, that it truly demands from the adventurous theoretician an attempt to essay how this proposed mechanism of resonance might work in reality. Look what it does for us. Actually, this is rather to be skimmed over. In the brain, we have this tumor, the living being race, the transmutation of evolution, where it was invented this attached piece of living matter made up of a mass of electrically connected particles, so massive that parts of it can go into random and be used to store information from the future. It's an incredible diversion from what was going on with those single cells organisms. The maximum they could do was eat somebody else's protein and reproduce. Suddenly they've got this tumor on them which has this fantastic electrical capacity. And I'm positing that what that electrical capacity is the capacity to transmit its own perception into the future. An amazing piece of technology, which we've all got here. It looks like grey matter, you can't tell what it is. So as well as being able to grab food, eat and breathe, this thing could now store information for the future. The point being, evolution of flesh or creatures evolved this new thing. It's not a feather, it's not a gill, it's not a tail, it's not a wing, it's a memory tool, completely different in kind. An array of billions of neurons. Looks like nothing, looks like a piece of sludge, but when it's operated using repetition, it transmits what happens today into the future, makes our entire civilization possible, and everything else. Before that, we have another extraordinary repetition thing that came into existence by random evolution, God, chance. Life had developed, or invented, or acquired by this chance mutation plus survival test system called evolution, maybe a molecule, a massively remarkable complex crystal within the cell that was actually capable of reproducing itself. Now, if it were a simple molecule that had 6 carbons and 8 whatnots around the hydrogen around the outside, and it were repeated, the degree of similarity would not be high. 6 plus 12 repeated. No. It's got immense number of things, all repeated. The spiral is a repetition. The way those CGTAs are repeated is a repetition. There's millions of degrees of repetition inherent in the molecule itself. And what's more, I think it's what you're going to see if you read the rest of this guff I wrote, there are billions of this same thing inside each one of us. It's a staggering degree of repetition going on all the time. So, if there's anything in this theory at all, you'd expect repetition, we would expect these facts to be generating more people with exactly the same DNA and exactly the same type of DNA molecule and so forth. I don't think I need to read you that. Those who've got the paper can enjoy it because it's repeated later. Electromagnetic induction. After this creature had come out of the sea, developed a brain, used its memory to transform its environment for build-up culture. But only then did it actually discover something called electromagnetism, started using that. What's the next thing we're going to discover? They also use massive quantum scale repetition. That's what electromagnetism uses, massive quantum scale repetition to propagate information, which is a good technological step for us. And all these three phenomena, I said, they're all from the same source. Greavesian repetition. I'm establishing Greaves is what does that thing to do with the flag staking out claim to Antarctica, right? So, as my daughter used to say, as an adolescent, is this exciting or what? So, I now do a quick rerun. Central postulate. Patterns in time reproduce themselves in space. Patterns in space reproduce themselves in time. But this only happens where the degree of similarity is high. The principle works. I'll try and do it. But, for 10 minutes. But the degree of, so the rest of this is about the degree of the degree of similarity, how we quantify it. And just to bring out the point here, there may be situations, this may happen in situations where an event at a subatomic level is repeated a few times, because things at near Heisenberg scale repeated have strong power. They're close to that edge. Or an event at just over atomic scale is repeated quite a lot. Or, curiously, an event at live creature scale is repeated only quite a lot. Might do it because inside each creature there are billions of exactly similar DNA molecules, and each brain has billions of neurons. Well, and what I'm looking for, the purpose of writing this was to look at, actually I've actually said all that, is to look from, think about how one might construct a mathematical way of describing degrees of similarity. The more I repeat the shape, the structure, the concept in my own present-day brain, the stronger the memory. We all know this. We use repetition as one of our main routes to memorize. We all know that. Right? And this, theoretically, would be why. A case of structure, repeated, transmitting over time. Now this is basic. This memory is not in any way written on the material of the brain. It's not written on the material. The shape recurs in the second brain because repetition has caused any similar brain cloud, momentarily in random state, at another location in time or space to form the same structure. From if the start, a corner or beginning of that structure is implanted in. The memory is written on and is read from, quote, the Akashic Records, which I'll refer to, which some of you may remember. It's not written anywhere in the material, quote, world. So, when in my memory, the most probable receptor will be the same brain at a later place in time. That's because occurrence of a very similar brain at a different place in the same location in time appear in the same location, similar brain, it seems unlikely. Also, such another brain would have to be similar in material and have an area in it in a random state at the location at that time. This does, however, occasionally occur and is called telepathy. But this paranormal thing to happen, both brains have to be in a random state at the same time. Anecdotally, we hear that psychics, those who can do this, are non-intellectual. Some part of their brain is random a lot of the time. It's better if they're far-gone woo-woo mystics, right? If they're not living in the Cartesian world. Alternatively, it helps if the two brains may be synchronized, husband and wife. My wife used to call the phone. I always knew it was her on the telephone. You've all had that experience, I expect. Maybe willingness to go randomly in each other's company makes it happen. This is just a note about the Akashic Records. In the 60s, those who were drinking from the hippie culture will have heard of the Akashic Records. I think it's a Hindu or something.
It was from theosophy.
Theosophy. Concept of a place where...
Akasha means space in Sanskrit.
Sanskrit.
It means space, that's what Akasha means.
Where everything has ever happened is written. It's a place where this is that thing. This principle is that thing, and it's from this principle it will be clear that if a person trains his mind to go appropriately around, he might even be able to read those records directly. Whatever, maybe some technology you can do with your stuff can do it. You get into things like perceiving past lives, knowing past events, and other of these woo-woo psychic jobs, right? All we're dealing with, after all, are electrical and similar structures, as understood by some rather advanced thinking about physics, maybe, inside huge, vastly large 3D neuron network, a large piece of technology. That's all it is. It's not mystic. It's in there. If you've read Castaneda, you'll know that 99% of our waking time, since post-Cartesian 20th century tech-based knowledge and reason-worshipping society was sort of brought to the fore, hardly anyone ever puts their mind into random state. It's a thing of the Middle Ages, mystics, the Middle Ages. I've got six pages to go. This is looking now at genetic reproduction, in which the oak leaf is just like its dad and I have my dad's eyes. When first plants gave leaves, the oak for the first time reproduced. The first leaf that came out was shape A, a random mess. Later, sprouting leaves each came out randomly different until one was a near repeat of a previous one. Well, what was going on? First, near random cell division produced a random shape A from a tightly defined template. a complex single molecule structure DNA, like a crystal, but carrying much more complexity. Generation 2 produced another different random thing. It was not written on the DNA. The first time that DNA ever produced a living object, cutting Newtonian space into bits, if you ever say. First time that ever happened. Where am I? Can't find where I am. Generation 2 produced shape B in the next Y up to N. When shape N occurred that was similar to shape A, it was a fact that had happened and increased the probability of that same shape being produced a third time from that particular DNA, which had no information written on it, was just a beautiful crystal, a beautifully symmetrical crystal. Increased the probability of that shape being produced a third time. Influenced by that probability, at a later date, a third leaf with the shape approximately A emerged, partly by chance, perhaps partly influenced already by mounting Greaves-in repetition effect. Each repetition, chance or otherwise, enhanced the probability of repetition of form. Now, millions of generations later, all oak leaves are the same. That's the mechanism that Greaves envisages for the reproduction of life, a form in life forms. Now, if you want some mathematics, this is not really mathematics, but I'm sure you can improve on it. How similar? What's the maths? This is a big one. Sorry, I did this rather fast last night. The DNA carries repetition. It's massively repeated throughout the creature's body. This repetition is the first of the tools used by nature for reproduction of form. It has an immense bank of similarity on which that particular bank of similarity catches on to that leaf shape. First time, second time, third time, and you're away. This repetition is the first of the tools used by nature for reproduction of form. But the correspondence between that DNA and that nose, those eyes, is not that the form of the nose is written on the DNA, it's that the correspondence between that DNA and that physical form has happened before and therefore happens again. You could say it's written on the Akashic Records. It's a fact which by resonance will be repeated. Before that particular DNA was ever used for the first time for reproduction, it's the imaginary event of the DNA already existing and never having reproduced.
Just 10 minutes, Steve, thanks.
Well, maybe make it. Anyway, why do I say that? I'm looking at the degree of similarity. The first formula is, well, the degree of similarity before it's done reproducing is the similarity of the DNA plus no extra thing. Then we add, the first system consisted of the mass of the DNA plus a random leaf. The second was mDNA plus 2 random leaves. The third was mDNA, the mass of DNA plus 3 random leaves. When the first repeat leaf comes out, we get a new element of similarity to add to the pot, the formula. So that we have a system which consists of the mass of DNA plus the same leaf having occurred twice. So the probability that that particular mass of DNA will give that leaf again is now higher. We could say, I'm putting in a line of... Anyway, cut a long story short. Maybe that plus should be a times, maybe that squared should be something exponential. That's what we don't know. How much each one of these similarities, degrees of similarity, influences any other. Anyway, next time the same leaf appears, the results tend to snowball. And we see that result today, and we call it nature. We've never explained it, but this explains it. Okay, the rest of that page is obvious. I've got to cut this down. I'm inventing the degree of Counter-Heisenberg Singularity, call it sigma backwards, I don't know, call it something. And it will be the sum of various terms. There'll be one for how similar the DNA is in that particular example. There'll be one for how many times the leaf is reproduced. There'll be you add up the terms for the separate types of cause, each one being a degree of similarity. In the electromagnetic case, somewhere on this page, you only have one term really. There's a single electron passing a single place. That event is being reproduced all the time. It's being repeated. And there's no sort of ancillary extra degrees of repetition going on much. Well, there obviously are. We'll obviously analyze them. But that one only has one term or two. in your attempt to add up the degree of similarity. Okay, here's some consumer reactions on the last page. I was slightly technical, or I was invited to a party in December. There'll be plenty of astrophysicists there. And I met 3 astrophysicists from the Cavendish laboratory, 3 professors, as I understand it. I put a question to one of them. I was told to keep their names out of it by the person who gave the party. I put Greaves' theory, brought it to them as a one-line, and he said, it was gobbledygook. No one talks about Heisenberg anymore. It's all done with fields now. Well, I've got over that, and the brilliant thing I came up with last night. Don't look at it in terms of fields. Look at it, don't look at it in terms of particles. Look at it in terms of overlapping probability things, and theorize that this probability distribution influences his neighbors when you get close to complete repetition. I asked another one, can a mathematics be written to describe this sort of question? Multiple degrees of similarity. Very quickly said, no, we can't. There's too many variables. Now that's a top astrophysicist, and I've been trying to do it last night. I can already see I can begin, right? So the next steps. I need your help. 2 things. To better define the mechanism for this resonance instead of throwing the idea out the window. It's a resonance across time and space. I may have improved the working method by looking at it through wave probability lenses rather than as particles, which do something mysterious. And then you have to work on the maths of similarity. The last page says, there's a guy called Art Chester, who was a top scientist, practical scientist, with chief technologist at Hughes Aerospace when Reagan was trying to invent things to go up there and knock down missiles. And in private, he pursued a mathematical demonstration of ESP based on repetition, and he got friendly with Greaves because of that. I saw his proof, 300 pages. I couldn't get further than the first formula. Probably makes sense. I can find copies of it for you if you want. And I've also got an 8-page letter from him to Nick Greaves in 1984, in which he acknowledges that he, Art Chester, Greaves and Sheldrake all look at the same material through different lenses. He's a serious scientist and engineer, as I've told you. I'm just puzzled telling you about Dr. Johnson, so what have you got to say to that? I'm going to be most serious.
Some comments. First of all mathematics is about similarity. That's all mathematics is about. For example, take the number 2. Well, this is not the number 2. The 2 has some similarity to 2 fingers, or 2 parts of a pen.
But 2 is
all
also
mathematics is about similarity. That's all it's about. Topology, for example, says that a topologist doesn't know the difference, thinks identical, teacup and a donut. So what's going on there? They're not identical. The kind of similarity that mathematics talks about is always of a form. There is a pathway from the one to the other, of some sort. For example, there is a pathway from the 2 pieces of the pen and the 2 fingers of some sort, which you perhaps could describe in your way and I would describe in mine, but there is a way to make them correspond, a pathway. There is a pathway from the teacup to the donut by deformation. All things thought equal have pathways between them when looked at carefully. All mathematics is about similarity, and all mathematics will apply to this in one way or another if looked at carefully.
But are you suggesting then that mathematics is all you need to do this? I mean, that's...
I'm sorry?
Are you suggesting that all you need is mathematics? But that doesn't seem to get anywhere, no?
I'm not quite getting what you're saying.
Well, you're saying all mathematics relates to this, but then you're not adding what else is needed or how one might conduct the use of
Well, but he asked us to search for a mathematics of similarity, and you have to begin by understanding that all mathematics is about similarity. And it may be that, for example, the entire edifice of topology, which is certainly about different kinds of similarity than classical geometry, may be applicable.
But look,
classical geometry is about similarity in a very simple sense, that similarity in classical geometry has to do with...
I was supporting you because you read number 2, which says
so
this is
I'm
similar
making
to
a
that.
foundational remark. I'm not saying this mathematics or that mathematics, but you must understand from the beginning that that's what mathematics is about. That's my first comment. I want to make 2 comments. I want to make that one and then I'll let it go, okay? The other comment is about DNA. It's very interesting to look at how it actually does reproduce, because it does it without having someone outside checking for the similarity. It does it from the inside by enzymes breaking the two strands of DNA into two separate strands, and then the environment provides the corresponding pairs, base pairs, to fill in the two separated strands to produce the two new DNA strands. And of course there are technical problems that nature solves in doing that, but the general idea is that there is a form which is of the form something and its dual, which come apart into an environment. And then the environment provides the duals to each one, and thereby comes the reproduction. So it is like electromagnetic reproduction with the pair of electromagnetic fields, electric field and magnetic field paired, which produce another electric and magnetic field pair and propagating along. There is an analogy between those two forms of reproduction, which is worth thinking about.
Yes,
Those are the two comments.
I was actually saying nature has already given us that magic by which it cuts into two. I'm just saying the fact that there are so many that are similar is an invisible similarity. Can't think who comes next. Who decides who's next?
There's a possible mechanism for overlapping similarity. It's called topological switching. You take all the known fields except gravity, because the graviton hasn't been discovered. They're phenomenological fields which transmit by an exchange of energy. So you can't use phenomenological fields because of the uncertainty principle. But a Bohmian type of ontological field, like conceptually evidenced in the ambiguous figure of the Necker cube, if you had information here and you applied a proper resonance, it would transmit to the other state of the Necker cube ontologically without the exchange of energy. It would, that exact precise state could
Same area, aren't we? We're in the same area?
Pardon me?
We're in the same area, aren't we?
We're in the same area?
What you're saying is kind of the same area as what he's saying. Is that sort of
Well,
right?
you asked for a mechanism or a possible way of experimentally actually doing this, and that would be...
Oh, I'm going to have to study that because I can't
I think
figure that in. I need to learn this.
First thing,
Right,
I'm extremely keen to join in with any group that you are involved in doing this. This relates to things I've been doing since the 80s. And in fact, we're not just interested in any old causal relationships, we're interested in those classes of process which happen to propagate themselves in some sense. And they
Life. Great.
Well, okay, but it's not just that. I mean, it can be anything. We've got to keep the thing open.
Okay.
So, out of respect to the next speaker, can we just thank Stephen for his contribution and take any further questions later? Thank you.